This is, I think, is one of the sessions that's gathered a lot of interest, and one that I think in their session this morning already stimulated a lot of discussion. So we're here to discuss what would a social security system that tackles poverty look like. Obviously, all of us in this room will know that we've been through successive waves of welfare reform, not just over the last 4 years, but over the last 20 years at least. And this we haven't come to the right solutions yet. What we want to do in this session, I'll explain a wee bit more how the evidence sessions are intended to work. So this is our first evidence session around this theme of what would a social security system that tackles poverty look like. This is our first session. So this is to discuss some of the broad issues, some of the big questions that we face in relation to the social security system. In the next session, after we'll have a short coffee break, so in the next session, we then want to start going on to look at, right, well, we know what the big issues are, we know what some of the big themes are. What would actually some of the solutions start to look like? So we'll spend the last hour of the day looking at trying to be as focused as we possibly can be around what some of the solutions are. And then tomorrow, we'll make some decisions. We'll decide as a group, here are the things that we want to go forward. And this work is all partly feeding into Joseph Rowntree Foundation's work around an anti-poverty strategy for the UK. So what we want to say is, well, what are some of the things that we need? And it might be things that we can do differently in Scotland. It might be things that we do differently in the UK to get to a social security system that lifts people out of poverty. Now, the key things about these discussions is that one of the key things is that you need to contribute. So I really would encourage everyone, once we've heard from our first three speakers, to really debate some of these issues. We've got one of the things that we don't often have in these sessions is time. We have quite a bit of time to really try and get to grips with some of the issues and really think about what the solutions are over the next 2 days. So I'm not going to say any more with that. We've got three very good speakers. Yes, we do. And I think, John, are you going to go first, I think? Is that what we agreed?
Can do, yes.
Yep. So John Dickey, who I'm sure most of you, all of you know, is head of Child Poverty Action Group in Scotland. So John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks for asking me to contribute today. Just for those of you who maybe don't know CPAG, Child Poverty Action Group, we are a campaigning charity whose aim is to bring an end to child poverty in Scotland and as part of CPAG UK across the UK. We do that through two sort of interrelated strands of work. One is about raising awareness of child poverty, the impact that poverty has on children and families, and using that awareness to seek to influence policy in the interests of low-income families and particularly their children. And then feeding into that, and alongside that, we have developed and maintain a real expertise in the social security system, which we use to support frontline advisors, frontline workers, volunteers working with low-income families right across Scotland to ensure that those workers have got the knowledge and the skills they need to make sure the people they're working with are able to maximise their incomes and get the financial support that they're entitled to through the social security system. So what I'll kind of say is building on that experience for us as CPAG. Obviously, our key concern is the impact or the role that social security should play and needs to play in terms of reducing and eradicating child poverty. And I suppose to make the first obvious point is clearly our current approach to social security is failing. We have a situation where 200,000, 1 in 5 of our children were living in poverty in Scotland alone, even before we started to feel the impact of the current government's approach to welfare reform or welfare cuts, the cuts we've seen. And what we know is that, according to independent forecasting by the Institute for Fiscal Studies, modelling the impact of the current government's approach, UK government's approach to social security and to welfare, that up to 100,000 more children will be pushed into poverty, primarily as a result of changes to the social security system between now and 2020. So clearly, something wasn't working anyway to prevent and eradicate poverty, and the approach we're taking at the moment is seeking to make matters worse. Why is that? I suppose I just want to flag up 5 key issues that I think lie behind the fundamental problems that we have with social security at the moment. The first issue I think to raise is that we leave our social security system in the UK to do far too much of the heavy lifting in terms of tackling poverty. Our social security system has to make up for huge failures in the labour market in terms of its failure to distribute rewards and income fairly from work, and failures in our housing market in terms of the hugely unaffordable housing costs that too many families face. And then we rely on social security to try and make up for that to a large extent. And we at CPAG recently commissioned analysis by the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Essex that looked internationally across the EU at the effect that the tax and benefit systems has on child poverty. And what was clear from across Europe was that social security is an essential tool for reducing child poverty, that across the nations, benefits reduce child poverty from what it would have been looking at incomes before tax and benefits impact on households. But what it also shows was that the UK had the second highest level of child poverty before looking at the impact of tax and benefits on incomes. So child poverty, looking at incomes before people receive their benefits or before they're taxed, what was their income pre-distribution through the tax and benefit system, meant that child poverty was really high in the UK. And actually our social security system does a lot of work to bring UK child poverty rates down to the middle of the table in terms of European comparisons. So clearly we're leaving social security to do a lot. And I suppose the other thing that analysis found was that that redistributive effect of social security was actually highest in the UK compared to other EU countries. But of course, what this means is that cutting or capping social security in the UK without tackling those underlying problems in terms of wages and failures in the labour market and the housing market means that children are exposed to even greater risk, because the risk of poverty is going to be even greater once we start removing that social security safety net. And what also I think key thing highlights is that we can't look at social security in isolation. We need to look at income from work. We need to look at housing costs alongside looking at social security. Second key issue I think to raise and to put on the table is, again, fairly obvious, but sometimes I think we kind of shy away from confronting it, is the basic problem that current levels of benefits are hopelessly inadequate to the task of protecting families and individuals from poverty, and even more inadequate in terms of ensuring that families have the minimum income that the general public believe is needed for a socially acceptable standard of living, and the work that JRF has done to identify that. So that, for example, benefit for an out-of-work family with children, benefits provide less than 60% of the income that the general public believe is the minimum needed for a socially acceptable standard of living. For a single person without children, it's less than 40% of the minimum income needed. And for people in work, it's still a problem. So those families where one adult is working full-time on the national minimum wage and receiving all their in-work benefits, all the in-work support from the social security system, they're still left with less than 75% of the minimum income needed to live a socially acceptable standard of life. So it's no surprise then that over half of children living in poverty are actually living in families where somebody is working. Third issue is the current system too often fails to treat people with dignity and respect. I mean, we know this secondhand from the feedback through our casework support and through our training and through the research. Many of you will know it far more directly than us. But examples from our casework support of severely sick and disabled people having to wait up to 6 months for PIP assessments at the moment, of lone parents being sanctioned without any clear communication as to why or for what reason, of severely sick people being told that they're fit for work. So too often, claimants feeling they're having to jump through pointless and humiliating hoops in order to get the financial support they're entitled to. I think it's a fundamental question there. Do we want to design a social security system that's there to try and catch out the tiny fraction of people that are maybe trying to defraud the system, or one that we all feel comfortable turning to in times of ill health, disability, or unemployment? Fourth key issue, I think, is the system being too complex. That's maybe an area where there's actually some consensus between us and government on that. The system's too complex. Too often people don't get the financial support they're entitled to from Social Security. The problem is that the current approach to supposedly simplifying the system through universal credit is actually increasing complexity within the system too often by introducing new conditions attached to benefits, by introducing further means testing, all of which adds to the complexity of the system. So I think if we're serious about tackling the complexity of our social security system, we need to get a better balance between means-tested benefits and universal benefits, like child benefit, which work extraordinarily effectively at providing financial support to families in and out of work, that have near 100% take-up, that don't create any issues as you move in or out of work. And finally, so I'm sure I'm running out of time, finally, I suppose the issue I want to raise, and I suppose the one underpinning perhaps everything else I've said, is the issue that our current approach to social security is, I think, driven by and built on what we might kindly say were fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of social security at the moment, but perhaps more accurately, sort of active myth-making on behalf of too many politicians and too many others taking those myths as received wisdom. Myths that spending on social security is somehow out of control, whereas in fact spending on social security as a proportion of GDP has been unprecedentedly stable up to the economic downturn, and then obviously there's been an increase then, as you'd expect in any economic cycle. Myths that fraud is a major problem when we know that actually less than 1% of DWP expenditure, benefit expenditure, is spent on fraudulent claims. Myths that Social Security is creating multiple generations of dependent families who have never worked, when a tiny fraction of 1% of households have more than 2 generations where no one's worked. So these are the kind of myths and the kind of beliefs that have become sort of part of the assumption on which we base social security policy. So I think it's absolutely crucial, to finish off by saying, I think absolutely crucial that if we want to gain the public support and the political will that's needed to make the kind of changes to social security that hopefully we'll identify over the course of these 2 days, then I think the biggest challenge will be to challenge those myths and to ensure that our discussion of social security is based on the reality and not on newspaper headlines or myth-making. Thank you. Great.
Thanks very much, John. Just going to move straight on. Yeah, I think actually, yes, Danny, you're right. Yeah. Some very clear messages there about big, broad trends that we can come back and discuss once we've heard from Fran and from Danny. Fran, I'll allow you to introduce yourself because it would take too long to do it properly. Fran Bennett is from Oxford University today, but Fran has a long history in working to tackle poverty, both as an academic, but also as part of the voluntary sector and as a campaigner. Fran, over to you.
That's fine as an introduction. Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much. It's really good to be here. I'm a Poverty Assembly virgin. It's the first time I've been, so it's great to share it with you. I was asked also to talk about the main issues relating to the social security system and poverty and their causes. And a lot of those have already been raised both by John and, in fact, this morning in our discussions as well. But I was also asked to refer to the review which a colleague and I have been doing for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation on gender and poverty. So men and women and their roles and identities and poverty as well. So I wanted to do a bit about that as well, if that's all right. I'm going to focus on the UK-wide system of social security, which I think John did as well, although I do recognise, obviously, that Scotland has some powers of its own in the area of incomes, and also that it's probably got some, the Scottish Government has got some different views from the Westminster Government on that, but I'm going to be looking at the social security system as a whole across the UK. And I'm also, like John, going to be focusing on social security under pension age, which is something we might maybe bring up in the discussion, because I think we may be focusing mostly on the younger end of the age range. I really welcomed the idea that this was called a social security session rather than welfare, because I think welfare is often, not as in the welfare state, but as in welfare reform, is often only thought about as the means-tested benefits rather than something which can provide security for us all. So I really welcome that. I also welcome the idea which is saying that the social security system is about tackling poverty, because I think that's wider than just the relief of poverty after it's actually hit people, which is basically all that means-tested benefits can do. So means-tested benefits, are, like John said, really, are not good at multitasking. They can only really relieve poverty after it's hit and after people have proved their poverty to the satisfaction of the authorities. So I was really pleased that you look at tackling poverty in this session, which also means preventing poverty as far as I can see, rather than just waiting till it happens and then helping people or not. And that leads me on to say as well that I think my belief is the social security system has a range of functions, which is not just about poverty. It's actually much wider than that, which I'll say a bit more about at the end. And actually there is evidence that the kinds of social security systems that don't just emphasise the relief of poverty are better at actually dealing with poverty than those which focus only on poverty. So I think it's really important that we think about those broader aspects of social security and not just those aspects of social security that have to do with poverty. Because if the broader aspects of social security are there, then other people, as well as those in poverty, have a stake in them, and that's more likely to mean that they're defended when they're under attack. So that was some of the general things I wanted to say. I think if you don't have a social security system that does those general functions as well, then all too easily it becomes a one-way street. So that too easily becomes us and them. So it makes it look like one group that pays for benefits and one group that actually gets them, which, as the Minister said this morning, is not true at all. Everybody needs benefits at some point. And there was somebody called Richard Titmuss, who was one of the British pioneers of the sort of study of social policy. And he talked about the public finances, but the same could be true of social security, being like Crewe Junction. And Crewe Junction, I know it's in England, but Crewe Junction is lots of different railway lines going in different directions. And he said it was better if you had a system like that, which had cross subsidies from one group to another, different times of life, different things going on, and not just a one-way street, which was money from one group going to another group. So the first main issue I wanted to emphasise was the politics of tackling poverty through the social security system, where poverty, I think, needs to be only one issue that the social security system deals with in general. Not just for other people's sakes, but also for the sake of people in poverty. But I wanted to look at gender and poverty and social security a bit more specifically. There are some general issues that I wanted to partly echo what John said before I get on to gender, but only very briefly because I wanted to focus on gender. So just general issues, apart from the political one I've just said. One is additional costs. And I completely agree with John about the adequacy of benefits being important. But picking up on something that was said this morning, of course, across the UK as a whole, a lot of people are now having to pay council tax out of their benefit without any compensation. David raised council tax this morning, but people on benefit, even when we had the poll tax, people were given an average amount of money in their benefit to pay for it. It wasn't enough for a lot of people, but with council tax, people haven't actually been given that. And I know in some areas, that the full 100% council tax benefit is still being given, but in other areas it isn't, and that's really eating into people's money. Another one is sanctions, which John mentioned and was talked about this morning. There's an increase in the number of sanctions, the severity of sanctions, and in general, the control of people's behaviour. The front page of The Independent today is talking about people who've been unemployed for a long time having to sign on every day, for example. The other thing that's happening is an increase in discretion in our social security system, which I'm really concerned about, having had a background working with welfare rights officers, where social security is a right, and there are laws about that, and there's more and more discretion these days, which increasingly opens the door to discrimination, of course. And the other thing is, also mentioned this morning, the increasing reliance on charity. So food banks and other organisations. The Minister mentioned that this morning. And as well, I think, a remarkable evidence of a lack of knowledge of what life is like on low income amongst the people who are in charge of certainly the Westminster government, and a lack of respect for the hard work that living on a low income entails by itself before you get on to anything else. Those were the general issues I wanted to mention to make sure you didn't think I was just focused on gender, but I did want to pick out a few issues from our evidence review for Joseph Rowntree Foundation. The problem about gender and poverty is usually measured at a household level, which makes it difficult if you're looking at couples to see any differences between men and women. But of course, that doesn't mean that the issues about what people do as men and women and the relationships between them and so on aren't important. Of course they are. They're not all relevant to social security, but some of the issues that I think are, I wanted to just talk about. One is access to income within a household. The government actually recognises that income isn't always shared fairly within the household, and it says that in households below average income in its official low-income document. And of course we know, and it now counts as domestic abuse, forms of financial control by one person in the couple controlling the other. But I've been working on universal credit recently, and the problem about universal credit in this particular area is that, of course, the proposal is that it all should be paid to one account in couples. The couples will choose what account that is, and it can be a joint account, of course, but some of the research I've done shows that just because you've got a joint account, you don't necessarily have equal access to it, and you don't necessarily have equal control. Somebody we interviewed, her partner had actually got all the money out of the joint account and gone on holiday with his mate. So just because it's a joint account doesn't mean that choosing one account for universal credit is not an issue. And the government wants people splitting the account, splitting universal credit between them to be quite minor. You know, they don't want very many people to have to do that, although they recognise some people, like domestic violence victims, will need to do that. But we think universal credit has got to work for all kinds of families, whether you have a good relationship at that moment or not. So universal credit ought to be able to be split between more couples if they want that to happen. Crucially, child benefit will stay separate from universal credit, even though I think Ian Duncan Smith would have liked to keep it in with it. And individual national insurance benefits will be kept separate. So that's really important, I think. The other thing about universal credit is we know in low-income families it's often women who do the budgeting, particularly in low-income families with children. And with one monthly payment of universal credit and no labelling of benefits anymore to say this is for children and this is for housing and so on, and no different payment days, it's all going to come in one big lump, including what you get for childcare and so on. Budgeting's likely to be made much more difficult by the policies that the government is actually adopting. And the Minister this morning said people on low incomes by and large budget really well. And actually, this is going to make it more difficult for people to budget. And then they're going to be labelled, I think, as people who can't budget properly. So those kind of things, I think, are really important. But looking at the causes of major poverty issues which are related to social security, one of them, I think, which John mentioned, is in-work poverty. Now, you may say that that's nothing to do with social security. And actually what John mentioned was, you know, somebody's in work and their children are still in poverty. But sometimes this is muddled up, I think, with low pay. So for single parents and single people, then often low pay and in-work poverty may be the same. But if you've got couples, then particularly for a man who's living in in-work poverty with his family, that's often because the other partner is not actually in employment. And they haven't got an income of their own when they're out of employment. So some work that I've been doing recently, for example, with Holly Sutherland shows that if you abolish national insurance benefits for things like being out of work, being sick, having a disability and so on, if you abolished all those, then in-work poverty would increase. Nothing to do with pay, but because of the people, the partners who used to get an income of their own would no longer be getting an income, so the family would fall into poverty. Now, something like abolishing the contributory employment and support allowance after a year for the work-related activity group, which has now happened, and means that people having to depend on their partners after that first year, means that in-work poverty is likely to increase. So when somebody says in-work poverty to you, Social Security is actually part of the solution to that, not just something about low pay or other issues. What that makes us think, I think, is that when we think about poverty, we need to think about the individual over the lifetime and not just the household as a snapshot at one point in time. So you need to think about what that person needs over the lifetime. If you like, prospects as well as pockets are important, and different situations and whether people have an independent income going in and out of different situations and in and out of different families, because that's what tends to happen these days. The other thing which it makes me think about, if you think about that, is about second earners, as we call them. So within couples, you may have one earner, but you've also got somebody else who, as I say, may be out of work, but may actually be wanting to go back to work at some point. And the problem about means-tested benefits in this situation is that it creates disincentives for that second earner to go back to work. And we know this from the government's own calculations about universal credit, for example, which is going to make those disincentives worse for those second earners than they are at the moment under tax credits. The problem about that is, of course, as soon as you increase your income, means-tested benefits get reduced because you're no longer in as much poverty as you used to be. And what it means is that for those people, it's very difficult either to help get their families out of poverty or to get themselves out of poverty and have an income which means they can save for a pension for their later years and so on. Now, you could try and put that right by something like a work allowance for the second earner, or you could put it right by saying we won't take universal credit away as soon as possible, but that would mean that there's more reliance on means-tested benefits. So I think it's important to look at things like child benefit in that situation and make sure that's high enough. And also something like the free early education years, which are not involved in the means-tested benefit system. They don't get taken away if you get a higher income, whereas your childcare help gets taken away as your income increases. So those are some of the things which came out, I think, of our gender and poverty review about issues to do with gender and poverty in the social security system. And just to finish with, just some general comments about that. Governments seem to have got a blind spot in their general approach to social security in relation to gender because they tend to focus on employment, so they talk about strivers versus skivers, but they don't talk about those people who are actually at home caring in order for those strivers to go to work. And they're actually striving at home caring as well. And also both parties at the moment seem to be wanting to reduce the social security budget rather than say, what kind of social security system do we need? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Fran. Danny, over to you now for a final few thoughts before we start to discuss as a group.
Okay,
I'll let you
everybody.
introduce yourself again, Danny.
Right. My name's Danny. I'm a father of 3 children at the moment. I've been asked to speak on a personal level rather than an organisational level, just about my experiences with the social security system. Now, I'm going to give you a wee bit of background information about myself first that explains why I get into that situation. As I say, I've worked all my life, and most of that has been on construction, heavy labour, for probably 30 years now. Now, in 1991, I had a son that was born, twins. One of my sons was born with spina bifida and hydrocephalus, which was completely new to me and my wife at the time. And that experience was something I wouldn't wish on anybody. But there was a lot of stress involved, and trying to keep up work and deal with the stress was pretty difficult, but we carried on. Now, in 1997, my son went for a routine operation. He was left brain damaged, and he nearly died, but he survived. So the stress levels and mental health problems were increasing as the time was going on, and it was very difficult to deal with it. And there was at times where I was continued to work, because obviously a family needs cash, you need to pay your bills. So, and going to Social Security, there was nothing available for us, simply because I was working. My wife was getting carer's allowance for Ryan. Now, after the trauma of Ryan being left brain damaged, my wife became pregnant, and in 1999 had another son born with spina bifida and hydrocephalus. So there was a whole lot of new problems involved with that, and that my aim was to continue working. Obviously, because when you stop working, your finances go down quite a lot. So I tried to continue working, and in about 2002, I was eligible to claim carer's allowance for my son. But because I was working, we were told only one parent can get carer's allowance for one child, although I had two children that were disabled. Again, there was a lot of stress involved, and it was taking its toll on us, and it was taking its toll on my family. And it was taking its toll on Ryan's twin brother, who started to develop a lot of problems as well. Now, in 2005, I had to stop work because the situation in the house was my wife couldn't cope while I wasn't there. So I'd actually to get somebody to give me a job, a different job, to swap jobs, get that guy to employ me, then pay me off. Because if I'd have stopped my work, I was told that I wouldn't receive any benefit for something like 6 months or 9 months or whatever it was. So I got a guy to give me a job, then pay me off. So, hope I'm not being too boring here. Now, I stopped work around about 2005 to carry on looking after Ryan and Josh. Ryan was 24/7. Obviously, he was brain damaged, couldn't do really anything for himself. So there was a lot of work involved, and it was taking its toll on me, physically and mentally. But we carried on working and doing our best. In 2010, I was informed by the doctor that I had cancer, and I would need to get my bowel removed. I would need to get chemotherapy. That was in May 2010. I get the operation done. Now, I was just recovering from that, and the same year in October 2010, my oldest son Ryan took no well and he passed away in October 2010. Now, the stress and the mental pressure that brought the family was incredible, and we just had to try and work through it again and get on with it. But again, we got help from the Social Security for Ryan's funeral, which cost about £3,000, and the Social Security gave us £1,200. Now, to pay the rest of that, we had to go and get a bank loan to pay for my son's funeral, which I don't think should happen, but that's what happened. And so we carried on. We were trying to get through it as a family, trying to keep together. And then in 2012, I had a lower abdominal hernia operation, which was added to the physical pressure and the mental pressure as well. So that same year, I was then sent for a Fit for Work interview with Atos in Glasgow. Now, to explain the condition I was in at that point would be pretty difficult, because it's only me that knows the condition I was in. Apart from having 30 years labouring, there was a lot of problems with arthritis in my spine and all these other things going on. And I went for a Fit for Work interview. And I went for the interview, and a couple of weeks later I get the letter in to say, you know, you're fit for work. And on the sheet, it was a point system that they're using, and on the sheet I'd scored absolutely no points. I was completely fit for work according to them. So thinking about it, then thinking back about the interview, me being assessed as fit for work, that decision was made before I even got to that interview, which I think was completely wrong. But the government would say, no, the interview was real. It wasn't even done by a medical professional, it was done by a girl who was a nurse. So anyway, they said I was fit for work and I'd need to go and apply for job seekers allowance. So that's what I had to do. That system is completely wrong for somebody like myself. I know the government are trying to get a lot of people that, as John mentioned, fraud. They're blaming fraud for us. As John mentioned, it's less than 1% people are committing fraud. Everybody else is suffering because of that. Now, my recommendations for a change in the social security system would be to take people like myself on a one-to-one and decide then, you know, really get to know, rather than taking you into just a wee interview, taking you, if they'd even come and live in my house for 2 days, you know, they'd be amazed at how that family still operates, to be completely truthful about it. But we manage. Now, my daughter is a single parent with 2 children, and at the moment she's bogged down by bureaucracy, trying to work, trying to keep her family going. So I think the changes need to be made there, because that girl has got to, she's got to go to the council office with wage slips. She's always running back and forward, council office, social security office, trying to run her family. That really needs to be changed. That's one change that really needs to be made for single parents that are trying and they're getting bogged down by bureaucracy. And I dare say it's adding a lot of mental pressure to people throughout the country, because I know it's doing that to my daughter at the moment. Now, I feel there's a media campaign, as John mentioned and Fran mentioned, about thrivers and skivers. After my interview for Fit for Work, I was made to feel like a scrounger. And I had spent my life working hard, working 12-hour shifts, labouring, destroying. I've actually destroyed my back as a result of it. But I was always a worker. And when it came to the point where I needed help, that help wasn't there. I was labelled a scrounger by the government and by the media, which I think is disgraceful, and it really needs to change. Now, there's a lot of people here, there's probably a lot of people in Scotland with the same problems as myself that are getting cast as skivers, and it needs to be, something needs to be done about it. I'm not as eloquent at speaking as Fran and John, because I don't normally do stuff like this. I'm usually mixing cement and throwing bricks about. But anyway, I'd like to be treated as a person rather than just a number on the government's score sheets. So I think when the day that happens, that'll go a long way to alleviating poverty in Scotland, because I really need help and my family need help, and it's just not there. Now, John touched on it, the level of benefit. Now, the level of benefit for myself, with having a disabled kid, is not enough because they don't take into account the lot of extra costs that I have to go through. Yeah, sure, they give you mobility allowance for a vehicle, but that vehicle has got to be on the road and it's got to be running, it's got to be filled with fuel. And currently, my son, who is he's severely disabled, right? So he doesn't. I can't let him out in the street or anything like that. So he can't run about. So I'm always looking for things to do for him, and all these things cost money. And all the clubs that he goes to, funnily enough, if you put a dot there and draw a big circle, all the clubs he goes to is at the outer limits of all these circles. You know, he's got 3 different clubs, 3 different clubs a week, every month. One of the weeks there's 5 clubs on the same week, and when that week's on, that cost me in the region of £100 to £120 to get him back and forward. That's not taken into account. That money's all coming out of my family. So where does that money come from? That money comes from my wife budgeting, who is extremely good at budgeting, especially at the moment. Now, we're taking that money from our food bill and our heating and gas bills. And we're currently getting into debt to the sum of, I think at the moment it's working out maybe £30 to £40 every 3 months. It's gone up and up and up and up. And I can't see any way of that coming down, down, down. So I think the social security system should look at that and help me out, because I paid in for 30 years with the labour in my back, and I think I should get a return on that. But currently, I'm not. But I'm carrying on. And then we're hit with the bedroom tax, which I think is shameful, disgraceful. It should just be abolished completely, because that is just an attack on poor people who are already poor. The government are intent on making those people poorer. Now, one of the things that I think the government should be doing as well is they're handing contracts to private companies. Now, they're handing people's welfare into the hands of money men. That just should not happen in a civilised country like Britain. I mean, the people before us worked hard, and people died to get the welfare state and get the conditions that we live in now. So really, there should be an end to the government handing stuff to private companies, because private companies are not interested in people. They're only interested in figures and cash. I think that's about it, Peter. I hope I've not bored everybody senseless. Is that okay?
No, I think you need to retract that statement about not being as eloquent as other people. I think you definitely are. Now, what we have now is a little bit of time before we break for a coffee to discuss some of the broad issues that Danny, Fran and John brought up. So I want to kind of throw it open for some brief discussion, some points, just to question what people have said, to add to some of the contribution. And I have roving mics, just for those of us who might need them. So I just want to throw it open, just some reflections on these broad themes. What do we think about them? Do we agree with them? Are there other things that we'd want to add in? So who would like to go first? If you just say who you are as well and where you're from, just so as well know.
My name's Chris Muirhead. I'm an unpaid carer on £61 a week, picking up the pieces after traumatic psychiatric treatment of one son who had his human rights abused within a psychiatric hospital, and another son who has a mental disorder label also. I wanted to say something about disability. I have a concern that we tend to think, to target people with disabilities when actually the system causes disabilities. Definitely in the mental health system, people are given lifelong mental illness labels by psychiatry, so the system disables people. So therefore, the system should be supporting people well, and not just basic stuff, but actually, there but for the grace of God, any one of us. So I think the system is liable for anybody with a disability. I think people deserve everything they can get in terms of benefits, social security, call it what you like. And I know the government's talking about doing stuff for unpaid carers, because I've been at the Carers Parliament, and there's been a lot of talk, and I hope there's going to be action, because I always think there's, we're good at talking, and I think that, action's a bit different, and I want to see results, because as an activist and campaigner, I am concerned. There's been a lot of things said, and I attend a lot of stuff to be meaningfully involved, when actually it's tokenistic and meaningless a lot of the time. And, you get really fed up. I'm now a writer. I used to be a development worker for most of my life, but now I write because I could keep, jagging at folk and pinning them down, because I think it's easy to say you're going to shift things, but we really want it shifted.
Yep. Okay. Thanks, Chris. Who would like to? Richard. There you go.
Richard Gass, Rights Advice Scotland. Just continuing on the issue of carers, and we're looking at problems within the system. If someone on benefits doesn't get a carer's allowance because they have another benefit worth a bit more, they have the underlying entitlement to a carer's premium. If someone comes out of the benefit system into work, and the only reason they're not getting the carer's allowance is because they now earn too much, they do not get the underlying entitlement. And the government makes a lot of rhetoric about making work pay and equal treatment for carers, but there's one straight away, that a carer who manages to find employment, and let's face it, many carers have to find employment in order to make ends meet, but the benefit system defeats them.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah.
Isabella Kelly, Tankside Information and Advice Centre. On your point, Danny, with the bedroom tax, I completely agree with you. It should be abolished, because the way that the government is working it is that you do not have a choice about paying that bedroom tax. If you are receiving housing benefit from your benefits, they will take the bedroom tax off of that, and then you are in rent arrears. So you do not have a choice, and I totally agree that it should be abolished. And obviously, they're taking into consideration, like, if you've got a disabled child, and where I am from, in Glasgow area, some of these people have to actually, because the child is disabled, doesn't even give them the right to have a free bedroom. They've still got to pay for that bedroom for that child. And I think it's a total disgrace. It should be abolished.
Thanks very much as well. Yeah.
My name is Obi Irebu. I am from Sterling Citizens Advice Bureau. One thing I must be proud to say that I learned today, especially this evening, was the information from this first speaker, who spoke and said that benefits generate less than 60% of income for those in work. It is a very, very important information that I'm taking home with me. I'm a social policy worker in CAB, and I consider that information very, very useful. Therefore, it would be helpful to formulate this policy considering that we need to generate more work as a part of our social policy and as a part of the social security system we're trying to put in place. Then we can also increase income of workers. If we increase the income for workers, it will help those who are on benefits realize that the more they work, the more income they can get. And this will discourage benefit cheats. I have no doubt in my mind that those who are on benefits are not there because they want to be there, but it's the circumstance they found themselves. Therefore, benefits should not be seen as an encouraging tool of income for people. A full-grown man should be ready to go to work and generate money on the table and put food on the table for him and his family. That approach is what government has been trying to do through DWP, but unfortunately, there has been too much bureaucratic bottlenecks. If that can be reduced to a level where it will be acceptable within the society, I have no doubt in my mind that that social policy guideline we're trying to put in place will be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was one just at the front. There you go.
Jeanette Campbell, Citizens Advice Scotland. Danny, I thought you spoke so well, and I would love to be able to go home tonight and go, God, I heard this guy, you'll never guess what happened because it was unusual. And that's the really sad thing. On the Citizens Advice Scotland website, we've got a case study that is so like yours, a mum who was trying to fight for getting carers payments when her child reached 16, who was dying of a terminal illness, and she'd already lost one son the same way. And, you know, the day of the funeral, she was still getting the letters coming in going, you owe us thousands of pounds. And I just wanted to actually pick up on something John said, that the theme about tackling poverty, I thought what you said about tackling myths was so important, because that's brand new, and that's new over the last few years of this government, that we have all these myths that are just seen as this is true now. It's true that everyone is a skiver, a scrounger. There's generations of work-shy, workless people somewhere in a mythical place in Glasgow that Ian Duncan Smith once visited or something. And it's so depressing that we have to be tackling that as well as the root causes of poverty. And that's brand new for all of us that are in this room.
Thanks. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. Hi, my name's Chris Baird from Poverty Alliance. And again, just to pick on that about the stigma and demonisation, particularly of disabled people and people in benefits as well. You know, the JRF, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, done a report where the public are starting to believe all this drip-fed disinformation that's becoming from the politicians and from the media, and they actually believe that people are undeserving, and the reason that people are in poverty is because of their own personal failings rather than looking at the underlying causes of poverty. And I think that's really important, because what does it say about us how we value people when we portray people as being a burden and a drain in society? Is that how we value people in 21st century Scotland? I don't think that's acceptable. And I think we want to see a social security system that treats people with dignity and respect. And people have to realise that people are believing these myths and lies realise it could quite easily happen to them or a member of their family. And that's what social security is. It's a social safety net that we can all benefit from. And also, you know, we keep hearing about benefit fraud, but we don't hear very much about tax avoidance, which costs the country a whole lot more money. And why is the reason is that? Because the government are bullies picking on the weakest in society rather than going off after the people that are really taking the money out of society. And if they went after these people, there wouldn't be any need for all these draconian cuts as well. And it's totally unacceptable. And I think there really needs to be a campaign to address this and put some balance in it, because people are starting to believe these myths, and that's why we're starting to see increases in disability hate crime because of all this disinformation, demonising people, and I think it really has to be challenged. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Two microphones. Is there? Sorry, almost missed you there. No.
I think it is very difficult to work out the system, because you've got loads of folk out there that come to me and say, we're both working. How do we justify it? They can't get working tax credit, they can't get anything, right? Because they're maybe making £25,000 and 60 pence. But after their tax and national insurance, they're really only taking home maybe 18 or 19 grand, so they can't get nothing. And I hate sitting in a room where people keep saying it's due to fraud. The majority of the fraud cases was proven when the Labour Party was in, that 9/10 of the cases came from people making a mistake with their, working tax credits. It wasn't a fraud, it was the government itself that done that. And that is half the label that's out there, eh? But for us all to sit and say it's they folk that are committing fraud, Nobody kens who committed fraud. It's just the stigma that's out there, and everybody just adding to it doesn't work. But it's great to sit and say, everybody should go out and work. Lots of folk out there with disabilities want to work, but who's going to bloody employ them? And that's the problem. If the government stopped giving out all these big businesses money for to say, you take £2,000, you take £5,000, you take that, and actually provided decent jobs for people with disabilities and made folk take them, maybe the world would change. But until that actually happens, there's still got to be huge discrimination out there, and disabled people will never get the opportunities. They're just the same as everybody else.
Thanks very much, Susan. No, thanks very much. I think I've lost my watch. Yes, we have gone over 3 o'clock, as I suspected. I think this has so far given us a very good overview of the big issues that confront our social security system. What I'm going to propose is that now we take a short coffee break, basically to go and get a coffee and then come back, even though we're not really allowed to bring coffee in here. If you don't, I think I've just live streamed that I'm going to break the rules in here. Never mind. I think if we come back in and then just try and keep our discussion going, we're going to hear from Alex from Scottish Government and Richard from Glasgow City Council to start moving us towards a discussion that's focused on, right, well, what are some of the things that practically we can do differently? And we've identified a lot of issues already around, particularly around disabled people, around people getting back into work, around issues for carers, benefits inadequacy. I've got a whole other sheet of things that we've come up with so far, but we want to start trying to break some of those down and maybe also to try and reflect on some of the issues that we haven't covered. Fran talked a lot about the gender dimension of the way that our social security system works. How do we effectively address some of those questions that Fran left us with? And also we are almost exclusively talking about working age benefits at the moment and working age social security. And I'm saying that partly because if I don't say it, Nell will pull me up for it later on, and that would never do. So don't look like that, Nell. You know you will. So there may be some issues that we haven't covered as well that we want to try and get into the mix in the next session. So if we just go and get a coffee, I'm sure they're outside somewhere, and then come back and we'll pick up where we left off. Thank you.